I'd just like to welcome everyone to the 3-2-1 process, the people who are watching the DVD and also you who are going to help us do the process this morning. And it's one of the 4 main practices that we do at the Integral Life Practice Seminar. There are 4 core practices. There's the physical, subtle body. There's the spiritual, which includes the big mind. There's the cognitive piece. And the 3-2-1, we call it the 3-2-1 of shadow work. And basically what it's designed to do and what it's intended for is to help you look at, explore, and address the parts of your unconscious and the parts of yourself that actually are not in your first-person awareness, and for whatever reason have become split off and are maybe popping up in the people around you, in your dreams, in other kinds of events, but for whatever reason you're not identified with them. So that's basically what we're here to do. The place that we'd like to begin is by exploring how we use the convention of perspective and language, how we use the third person, the second person, and the first person to describe, communicate, and understand reality. And in language, we have the same convention. We have 3 perspectives that we use to represent points of view: the first person, the second person, and the third person. So what is the first person in language? How's it represented, and what pronoun do we use?
I.
I, right. The person who is speaking. So it's I, it's me, it's mine. What about the second person?
You.
You, the person who's spoken to. And third person?
It.
He.
Yeah. We have a range, but basically it could be he, she, it, they. And interestingly enough, the further away something is from our awareness, the less consciousness it has. So if we move from I to you, and then from you to he, and then from he to it, it becomes an it. It becomes something that is not necessarily even human. Okay? So the 3-2-1 makes use of these conventions, and I wanted to talk about that because we're so embedded in the use of that in our language that we often don't notice the way in which the use of that perspective informs the way we see and the way that we understand. So it's a really important and interesting thing to actually take perspective and look at it and understand how it's working for us. So there's one other point that I wanted to make just as we're getting started, and that is that there are 2 really important contributions that the West has made to spiritual development and to psychological development in general. And the first is this, sort of discovery and framing of what I was calling the shadow earlier. And the shadow is really the unconscious material that is no longer held in first-person awareness. For whatever reason, because it's painful, because it's distressing, because I've been shamed for it, I can't experience something as me. And so instead, I have a way of unconsciously moving it out of my awareness, but it pops up in second person in you, or it may pop up in third person. So for instance, I'm angry, but I don't like it. I don't think I should be angry. I've been shamed for being angry. I've been told it's not good. All of a sudden, I'm having an altercation with my spouse. I'm not angry. Who's angry?
They are.
Yeah, he is. My husband's angry, the other person's angry, and I'm not angry. Those people are angry. So we're moving from holding it in first-person awareness into second person and into third person because it doesn't actually ever disappear from our consciousness. It's always a part of our world and a part of our consciousness, but our ability to identify with it is impaired for some reason. That's what we mean by shadow. So that's the first contribution. The second contribution is what we talk about as stage development. And you're very familiar with Ken Wilber's work, and he emphasizes this a lot, that within the contemplative traditions, and particularly in the East, that through meditation, we have really mapped the experience of meditation. We know what it's like to turn inward, to look into the eye, and the entire territory of the first person I perspective has been very well developed. But what hasn't happened and can never happen really from a meditative point of view, is that what actually happens to consciousness when it's viewed from the third person. That when you stand back from it and you watch meditators over time, or you watch anybody over time, you can actually perceive developmental stages that unfold in a pattern, or they unfold in a predictable kind of process. And the fact that stage development, number one, is occurring and that we're all participating in that whether we know it or not, and that it can be mapped is a really important contribution that psychology is making to the work that we're doing in our spiritual lives and also in our emotional lives. So does that make sense to everybody? You all clear about that? Good. So what does healthy stage development look like? To use Robert Kegan's terms, healthy stage development is when the subject of the first stage of development becomes the object of the subject of the next stage of development. And that's a very abstract way of talking about it. I'm going to try to explain it. An example would be that in, let's say, conventional or ordinary human development, that there's a very important stage of development where a teenager moves from being primarily identified with their family into being identified as an individual. And we might call that individuation or emancipation. And a healthy example of that particular stage of development would be that a teenager struggles with that. It's in their first-person awareness. They feel the tension of not having the freedom that they want to have, and they're, basically immersed in that struggle, and pushing against the family and its constraints and all those traditional kind of parental, boundaries that have been in place. And that is subject. That's all in the awareness of the teenager. And the teenager doesn't exactly have the capacity, while they're fully engaged in that emancipation, to stand back and look at themselves emancipating. And what happens is you'll see a couple of years down the line, after they're, maybe when they're in their early 20s, they have the capacity to stand back now and look at themselves having gone through the emancipation process. So what was subject to them actually can become object in their awareness. They can reflect on it, they can think about it, they can evaluate it, and through that, they can actually let it go. They can actually move on and become a healthy individual who has transcended, if you will, their family of origin, but now it's part of them, so it's transcended and included. But they're not attached and they're not struggling in the way that they were when it was just subject for them. Does that make sense to everyone? That's what healthy development looks like. So basically the subject becomes the object of the subject of the next stage of development, and then because it's been reflected on, understood, it can be basically set free. It's not that it disappears entirely. It's always part of the history and the memory and the psychological makeup of any individual, but you're free of it. You're not captured by that process anymore. You're able to move on. So unhealthy development is when that doesn't occur. And that happens actually a lot of the time. And for whatever reason, and we could even use the same example, that let's say in certain families, the idea that a teenager might become a separate individual or emancipate or now identify primarily with their friends and not with their parents, for whatever reason, that's not acceptable. So that process or that impulse, let's say, to be an individual gets pushed away and doesn't really get identified with. And so then a certain kind of rebelliousness starts popping up in the field all over the place. And the person themselves doesn't experience that rebelliousness, but rather experiences it all the time in terms of difficulty with authority or lots of charge around other people who are rebellious, or who knows, because for whatever reason they haven't been able to hold that, emancipation process in their first person.